I was already inside the lobby when I realized I'd made a mistake. Not a serious one, just the kind of small miscalculation that comes with getting older. I'd left my debit card on the kitchen counter beside my coffee mug, which meant I had to go in person to the teller window instead of using the ATM like I normally would. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of gray, sharp-aired day that Toronto does so well in autumn, and I hadn't bothered changing out of the clothes I'd worn to rake leaves in the backyard that morning. Old jeans, a faded green flannel shirt, and the work boots I've had since my 40s. I was 63 years old, and I needed $120 in cash for a contractor who was finishing some work on my rental property in Scarborough. That was all. A simple errand on an ordinary Tuesday. The branch was one I didn't visit often. I had accounts at several institutions, and this particular location, a mid-sized branch in a commercial plaza near Don Mills Road, wasn't my primary one. I had opened an account here years ago as a convenience, and I kept a modest balance in it for local expenses. I walked in, took my place at the end of a short queue, and waited. There were 3 teller windows open, and maybe 5 or 6 people ahead of me. I looked at my phone, checked a message from my contractor, and shuffled forward as the line moved. That's when I noticed her. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was standing near the glass-walled office at the far end of the teller area, speaking with a younger employee. She hadn't seen me yet. She was dressed sharply dark blazer, hair pulled back every inch the branch manager she had become 8 months earlier. I'd been to her promotion dinner. I'd shaken her hand and told her I was proud of her. My son Marcus had beamed all evening. I almost raised my hand to wave. Then she looked up, and our eyes met, and I watched something cross her face. A flicker of recognition followed almost immediately by something else, something cooler. She looked at my flannel shirt. She looked at my boots. She said something to the employee beside her, and the young woman glanced briefly in my direction before nodding. Vanessa turned back toward her office without acknowledging me. I told myself I'd imagined it. I reached the front of the queue, and a young male teller, his name tag said Daniel, greeted me pleasantly. I slid my bank card across the counter and asked to withdraw $120 from my checking account. Daniel typed something, looked at the screen, typed again. Then he paused. He cleared his throat softly and leaned forward just slightly. "Sir, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing a note on this account that I need to get a second approval on withdrawals today. Could you wait just a moment?" I told him that was fine. He walked to the side and spoke quietly with a colleague. Then that colleague walked toward the glass-walled office. I waited at the counter. Behind me, I was aware of other customers in line. I checked the time on my phone. 4 minutes passed. Then Vanessa came out. She walked up beside Daniel and positioned herself just slightly in front of him, the way people do when they want to make it clear who holds the authority in a room. She wasn't looking at me exactly. She was looking at the screen. "I'm the branch manager," she said, still not meeting my eyes. "I've been asked to review this transaction personally." "All right," I said. "Can I ask the purpose of the withdrawal?" I looked at her then, directly, and I said, calmly, "I need cash for a contractor. It's $120, Vanessa." The use of her name made her glance up. There were perhaps 4 or 5 other customers within earshot. A woman 2 spots behind me in line had stopped scrolling her phone. The man at the adjacent window was watching in that careful way people do when they don't want to appear to be watching. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but something in her voice shifted sharper, quieter. "We have protocols for certain accounts, sir. Customers need to be able to demonstrate the legitimacy of their transactions." I let that sit in the air for a second. "I'm withdrawing $120 from my own account," I said. "I come in, I show my card, I provide my identification, which I'm happy to do, and I withdraw my money. That's how this works." "Sir, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice." I hadn't raised it. I knew I hadn't raised it because I'd made a conscious decision not to. This is something my father taught me when I was young. The man who raises his voice first has already lost the argument. I'd carried that with me my entire adult life. "I'm speaking at a normal volume," I said. "I'd like to complete my transaction." Vanessa straightened. She looked at me the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they've decided to move out of the way. "I think what might work better for you," she said, loudly enough that I was certain the people behind me could hear, "is if we direct you to the ATM in the vestibule. For small amounts, that's really the more appropriate option. We like to keep the teller windows available for customers with more complex needs." Small amounts. More appropriate. I'm not a man who embarrasses easily. I have spent 40 years in business. most of it in commercial real estate, and I have sat across tables from people who were far more deliberately cruel than Vanessa was being in that moment. But I will tell you honestly, standing there in my work clothes, in a public lobby, being told by my son's wife that the teller window was not the appropriate option for someone like me that landed somewhere uncomfortable. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Thank you for your time," and I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes. I wasn't shaking. I was something else, very still, very clear-headed, the way I get when I've made a decision that I know I'm going to follow through on completely. I drove home, changed out of my flannel shirt, and made a phone call. Let me explain something about how I've lived, because it matters to what comes next. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. I grew up in a small town 3 hours north of Toronto, the second of 4 kids, in a house where money was respected precisely because there was never quite enough of it. My father worked at a mill. My mother did alterations and bookkeeping from home. We weren't poor in the way that means hungry. We were poor in the way that means careful. Every dollar had a destination before it arrived. I went to university on a partial scholarship and worked nights and weekends to cover the rest. I graduated with a commerce degree and went directly into property management for a mid-sized firm in Toronto. I was not brilliant or particularly well connected. What I had was patience and a willingness to do the work that other people found unglamorous. I walked through buildings other agents dismissed. I read zoning documents that put my colleagues to sleep. I understood early on that undervalued things, properties, businesses, ideas, have a way of becoming very valuable once the right person pays attention to them. I bought my first investment property at 31, a duplex in East York that needed a new roof and had a reputation for difficult tenants. Everyone I knew thought I was being reckless. I did the roof myself over 3 weekends with a friend from the mill town where I grew up who happened to know roofing. Within 2 years it was cash flowing comfortably. I kept going. One property became 3, became 7, became a portfolio that by the time I was in my mid-50s included residential buildings, 2 small commercial plazas, and a mixed-use development in the East End that I'd shepherded from vacant industrial land through 4 years of planning approvals and a financing structure that still makes me quietly proud. I did none of this loudly. I drove the same truck for 11 years. I wore the same style of clothes I'd always worn. I lived in a house in the East End that was comfortable and well-maintained, but not large. My neighbors, most of them, assumed I was a retired tradesman of some kind. I didn't correct them. I had made this choice deliberately. My wife Eleanor and I used to talk about it, this idea that real wealth is quietest when it's most secure. She died of cancer 8 years ago, and I have thought about her every day since. Marcus was 24 when we lost her, just starting his career. He held together better than I expected, but the grief changed him in ways I'm still learning to understand. He met Vanessa 2 years after Eleanor passed. She was ambitious and polished, and she wanted very clearly a certain kind of life, one she'd been working toward since she was a teenager in Mississauga, the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed enormously for her to have opportunities they hadn't. I respected that. I still respect it. The hunger to build something is something I understand deeply. What I didn't anticipate was that her definition of success was almost entirely visible. Visible in the address, the car, the clothes, the restaurant, the ring, the title. She measured enough by what other people could see. And when she looked at me in my truck, in my flannel shirt, in my work boots, she made calculations. I don't think she meant to be cruel. I think she just couldn't see me correctly. Marcus had told her in broad terms that I owned property and that I was comfortable. Whether she'd absorbed that information or filed it away as modest understatement from a modest man, I don't know. What I do know is that over the 3 years of their marriage, certain things had accumulated. The way she redirected conversations about money when I was present. The comments, always delivered as jokes, about my truck and my clothes. The time she booked a restaurant for Marcus's birthday and quietly upgraded the reservation to a private room on Marcus's credit card. A card she'd suggested he open without mentioning the cost until afterwards. I watched all of this and said very little because Marcus loved her, and because I believe grown people make their own choices, and because none of it was my business, unless it became my business. That Tuesday afternoon in October, it became my business. The phone call I made when I got home was to my lawyer, Patricia Osei. I've worked with Patricia for nearly 15 years. She handles most of my real estate transactions and knows my financial situation better than almost anyone alive. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Gordon, what do you want to do?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll have everything ready by Thursday." The second call I made was to my property manager, a man named Richard Dow, who has worked with me for over a decade. I told him I needed documentation leases, valuations, recent financial statements for the full portfolio. He said he'd have it couriered to me the next day. The third call was more difficult. It was to Marcus. My son answered on the second ring, cheerful, mid-conversation with someone in his office. He told them to give him a minute and came back to me. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I told him I'd had an experience at the bank that afternoon that I wanted him to be aware of. Marcus went quiet. I was careful. I didn't editorialize. I told him what had happened, the sequence of events, what was said, what I'd observed. I told him that Vanessa had spoken to me in a way that was, in my view, professionally inappropriate and personally disrespectful, and that I intended to follow up formally with the bank. I told him I was letting him know as a courtesy, not as an accusation. There was a long pause. "Dad," he said finally, "are you sure that's how it happened?" "Vanessa doesn't. I mean, she takes her job very seriously. She might have just been—" "Marcus," I said, "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm telling you what happened. You can speak to her yourself." Another pause. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, I'll talk to her." We said goodbye. I sat at my kitchen table for a while with a cup of tea, looking out at the backyard where the leaves were still half raked, the work I hadn't finished before the errand that changed the afternoon. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she used to say, that the hardest part of loving people isn't forgiving their flaws. It's helping them see those flaws without destroying their dignity in the process. I hoped I was doing that. I wasn't entirely sure. Thursday came. Patricia had arranged a meeting at the corporate offices of the bank, not the branch near Don Mills, but the regional headquarters downtown, with a senior vice president of retail banking named Andrew Forsyth. Patricia had sent a brief letter of intent ahead of time, describing a formal complaint regarding conduct at the branch level. She had not yet disclosed the full financial picture. That was intentional. I wore a suit. Navy, well cut, one of the few I own. I park it in the back of my closet for occasions that require it. I arrived at the downtown office building at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock meeting. Andrew Forsyth was a careful man in his late 50s, the kind of corporate executive who has learned to read rooms quickly. When Patricia and I were shown into the boardroom and he saw the two of us, a well-dressed woman who carried herself with the particular confidence of a lawyer who charges by the hour, and a man he had no reason to recognize, he adjusted. Not obviously, but I noticed it. We sat down. Patricia slid a folder across the table. "My client, Mr. Gordon Whitfield, has held accounts at your institution for 14 years, she began. On Tuesday of this week, he visited your Don Mills Road branch to make a standard withdrawal of $120. What happened during that visit and the manner in which the branch manager chose to conduct herself is documented in the formal complaint included in this folder." She paused. "I've also included documentation relevant to the scope of Mr. Whitfield's relationship with your institution." Forsyth opened the folder. He read the first page. He turned to the second. I watched his expression very carefully as he absorbed what he was reading: the account summary, the investment portfolio documentation, the certificate of assets Patricia had prepared, the total figure at the bottom of the financial overview. He looked up. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, and his voice had changed completely. "I want to begin by telling you how deeply sorry I am. I don't want to turn this into a story about a number. The number isn't the point. The point is what the number revealed about what had happened, about what had been assumed, and what those assumptions had licensed. The branch manager, Vanessa. My daughter-in-law was placed on administrative leave that same day, pending an internal review. The review, as Patricia later explained to me, involved an examination of the account access logs, which showed that Vanessa had looked up my primary account information on multiple occasions over the preceding 8 months, without any customer-initiated transaction to justify those queries. Under Canadian banking regulations and the institution's own conduct policies, this was a serious breach. Unauthorized access to customer financial information, even by a manager, even on an internal system, is not a gray area. I did not call Marcus after that meeting. He called me. He had, apparently, spoken to Vanessa the evening after my first call, and Vanessa had told him a version of events that was quite different from mine, that I had been confused, that I had raised my voice, that she had simply been following protocol. Marcus, to his credit, had been troubled by this, not because he disbelieved her automatically, but because he knew me. He had never, in 33 years, heard me raise my voice in public. He said this to her, and she had been dismissive, and that dismissiveness had unsettled him more than the original story. When the bank called Marcus because Vanessa had listed him as an emergency contact and HR had obligations under their protocol, the version of events became clearer. I met Marcus for dinner 3 days after the meeting downtown. A diner near my house, the kind of place we used to go when he was a teenager, vinyl seats and good coffee, and nothing on the menu over $20. He came in looking like he hadn't slept particularly well. We ordered. We talked about other things for a few minutes, the way Canadians do when there's something difficult to be said, finding the small, neutral ground first before moving toward the harder terrain. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, Dad." "You don't," I said. "I do. I chose her version of events over yours without enough reason to. That wasn't fair." I looked at my son across that table, the same face he'd had at 20, just a little more lived in now, and I thought about all the ways a parent can get this moment wrong. You can accept the apology so easily that the weight of it disappears, or you can make it heavier than it needs to be. Eleanor was always better at this than I am. "I understand why you did it," I said. "She's your wife. I don't think you did it to hurt me. I think you did it because you wanted it not to be true." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" he asked. "With her job, I mean." I told him honestly that I didn't know the outcome yet, that it was in the bank's hands, and that I had not pushed for any particular result beyond a formal acknowledgement of what occurred. He nodded slowly. He stirred his coffee. Outside the diner window, a streetcar moved through the October dark. "She looked up your accounts," he said. "It wasn't a question. She knew who you were financially, I mean, and she still treated you that way." "Yes." He sat with that for a while. "I think," he said carefully, "she's been embarrassed by you. Not in a mean way. I mean, she's felt that I come from less than she expected, and she's resented it. And I let that go on too long without saying anything, because I didn't want to start a fight." "I know," I said. "That's on me too. Maybe some of it." We finished dinner. He paid, which he almost never does, and I let him. We stood outside in the cold for a moment before going to our cars, and he hugged me, actually hugged me, something he hasn't done in years, since before the grief made both of us a little more careful with each other. "I'm going to figure things out," he said. I believed him. Vanessa resigned from the bank 2 weeks after the administrative leave began, before the internal review reached a formal conclusion. She and Marcus entered couples counseling in November. Marcus told me this himself, calmly, as a piece of information, not asking for my opinion. I gave none. They are still working through it. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what I actually wanted from that Tuesday afternoon. Not what I set in motion, the legal complaint, the meeting downtown, but what I wanted underneath all of that. The honest answer is simpler than it sounds. I wanted to be seen, not as a balance sheet, not as a man with a portfolio and a net worth and accounts at 3 institutions. Just as a person who walked into a bank in work clothes on a Tuesday and deserved the same basic courtesy as anyone else. That's it. That's the whole of it. I grew up watching my father be invisible in rooms where the wrong people decided who mattered. He never made a fuss about it. He just came home and built things: a garden, a workshop, relationships with people who treated him correctly. I inherited that from him, the preference for quiet building, and I don't regret it. But I've also come to believe that there's a moment, sometimes, when the quiet itself becomes a kind of permission, when not pushing back allows someone to conclude that they were right. I pushed back. I did it as calmly as I could, through the appropriate channels, without making it personal. I'm not sure I handled every moment of it perfectly. I've wondered whether the call to Marcus was the right call, whether I should have waited, whether I found the right balance between honesty and protection. These are the questions that don't resolve cleanly. What I know is this: money does not make a person worthy of dignity. The construction worker in line behind me that Tuesday, the one who witnessed the whole exchange and later, without my asking, told the bank's investigator what he had seen, deserved the same courtesy I did. The older woman who complimented my boots in the parking lot as I walked to my car deserved it too. Every person who walks through a door and asks for a simple, honest thing deserves to be met with basic human respect, regardless of what they're wearing or how much is in their account. We teach our children, if we're paying attention, not with speeches but with what we do when things go wrong. My father taught me that by coming home after being invisible in those rooms and treating the people around him with enormous care. I hope that somewhere in all of this, I've shown Marcus something about how to move through difficulty without losing yourself, without letting bitterness take root, without confusing a battle you need to fight with one that just feels good to win. I finished raking the leaves the following weekend. The contractor completed his work on the Scarborough property. I paid him in cash $120 as planned, and he did an excellent job. The flannel shirt is still my favorite,